We'll be going over the major divisions of the brain next week, but I'm going to throw in the brainstem here this week. Here is a diagram of the brainstem, and it's the lowest part of the brain that connects to the spinal cord. It's made up of three sections: the medulla or medulla oblongata, kind of a hard word to say. The pons is the next one, and the midbrain. The medulla, let me try and say this correctly, the medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brainstem. It's shown here in purple. The spinal cord just kind of becomes the medulla. There's really no clear separation between the two, but nevertheless, it's very important. It regulates cardiovascular and respiratory function. So the medulla regulates our heartbeat, our blood pressure, and our breathing. So pretty important stuff. It also helps to regulate swallowing, coughing, sneezing, vomiting. So if there's damage to the medulla, it's a pretty lethal thing. The medulla, interestingly, is indirectly involved in things like opiate overdose. So opiates, along with its analgesic properties, or pain-relieving properties, it targets the brain's reward system. So when you take opiates, you get feelings of euphoria and pleasure. This by itself is an extremely addictive property. And as with a lot of other drugs, your brain gets used to them as you take them, you develop a tolerance. So eventually you need to take more and more of the drug to achieve the same pharmacological effects. Opiates also lead to respiratory depression, and the medulla in your brain is the one area that doesn't develop a tolerance like it does other areas. So many drug users that think they can handle larger and larger doses, but your medulla never gets used to it. And this is what leads to the lethal respiratory depression that's seen in opiate overdose. So it's a pretty sobering fact, and it actually just goes to show you how important this region of the brainstem is. Okay, and let's see, we already talked about the medulla. Here's that for your slides. Okay, the pons. The next is the pons, and this is in pink. It's right above the medulla, and the pons has a lot of projections into and from the cerebellum and all throughout other brain areas. It's involved in arousal and circadian rhythms, but it's most known to be involved with motor function of the body. So pons, think motor. There's a really scary syndrome, which is pretty rare. It's known as locked-in syndrome. When someone has damage to the pons, normally due to a stroke, it can sometimes lead to this syndrome. In locked-in syndrome, you are completely paralyzed, like completely paralyzed. Some patients are able to move their eyes and blink, but they lose all control of their voluntary movements. But crazy enough, their cognitive faculties are left completely intact. So they're completely awake and they're aware, they can hear everything going around, and they're otherwise mentally intact. They just can't move their body or they can't communicate with people. Some patients are able to communicate through eye blinks, but it's very limited. And there have actually been cases where people are thought to be in a coma, but they're suffering from locked-in syndrome and they're completely aware the entire time. It's a fascinating but absolutely scary syndrome. I have a supplemental reading of a patient who had locked-in syndrome. This patient recovered, which doesn't always happen, but it goes to show you also that the pons is pretty important too. The last part of the brainstem is the midbrain. This has a lot of different areas in it. It's made up of the tegmentum and the tegmentum. The tegmentum notably has a few bumps, and that's shown in blue here in the left diagram. The top two sets of bumps are called the superior colliculi, and the bottom two are the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi respond to acute visual stimuli and things like visual orienting. So when there's a big sudden flash or an animal that suddenly jumps toward you, your superior colliculi fire and orient you to the situation. Inferior colliculi deal with auditory orienting. So when there's a loud sudden noise, you immediately jump up and turn your head to the noise. Your inferior colliculi, when I just banged my hand on my desk, they're firing right now. These areas evolved because they helped animals in our ancestral environments survive and avoid predators. Pretty useful features of the brain in my opinion. So overall, just when you think superior, think visual. When you think inferior, think auditory. The tegmentum, the other part of the midbrain, has a lot going on. There are a lot of ascending and descending nerve tracts. Some notable features of the tegmentum are the red nucleus, which deals with motor coordination, the periaqueductal gray, which is an area that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, and it's involved in responding to threatening stimuli, pain regulation, and inhibitory behaviors. The raphae nucleus is a major serotonin-producing group of neurons. We touched about this a little bit in our neurotransmitters lecture. And two dopamine-producing structures in the tegmentum are the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. So there's a lot going on with the tegmentum. Just be aware of some of these structures within them, especially in the midbrain. And just an FYI, some parts of the midbrain overlap with what we refer to as the basal ganglia, so just keep that in mind for later on.